Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video, and welcome to episode 2 of my series, which is called the Underdogs of Raiding. A series where we have a look at certain specs that were the underdog in vanilla, and how those specs changed throughout the years to become more viable in raids. Today we'll be looking at another spec that I hold very close to my heart, the Elemental Shaman. Ever since I saw Ionized's PvP video of him doing insane damage with Chain Lightning, I knew that my alt way back in vanilla WoW was going to be a shaman, more specifically, an elemental shaman. But, admittedly, elemental shamans had their problems when it came to dungeons and raids. Sure, they were quite powerful in battlegrounds and duels, and I still have a ton of fun owning face with my decked out Orc Shaman on Retro WoW, but even I can't deny that they have their shortcomings when it comes to the vanilla era of World of Warcraft. Sadly, an elemental shaman doing raids was a rare thing, and they were definitely the underdog at the beginning of the game. So, without further ado, let's once again go way back to 2004, where the journey of the Elemental Shaman begins. Let's bring up the talent tree that shamans had in the beginning stage of vanilla. Now, the last talent in the restoration tree is Mana Tide Totem, a totem that regenerates a lot of mana when used. Now, if you watched episode 1 about the balanced druids, I said that Innervate was an absolute necessity, so you had to go resto for raiding, and unfortunately, the same applied to shamans. Mana Tide Totem back then was just way too good to skip. So unless you had that talent and you were resto, the chance of you joining a raiding guild were extremely low. So what about the handful of shamans that did try to make elemental work in PvE? Well, like the balanced druids, they were pretty much stuck doing dungeons and almost nothing else. But it's not all bad. During dungeons, elemental shamans could actually do some decent damage, as they were good at doing burst damage, especially if you went for the talent Elemental Mastery, which would give you a guaranteed crit every 3 minutes. There was a problem though, as elemental shamans would go out of mana very quick, especially if you used shocks and chain lightning in your rotation, as they were very mana expensive spells. This meant that the rotation for shamans was most of the time very simple. First you deploy the totems depending on your group, and then you start spamming Lightning Bolt until you have to refresh the totems and then continue spamming Lightning Bolt. Rinse and repeat. Time to move on to the later stage of vanilla, where we find the talent tree that is widely known amongst vanilla private servers. What you're looking at right here is a basic PvE spec for the Elemental Shaman, and I'd like to point out a few things here. First of all, shamans got 20% extra range with spells with Storm Reach, and more importantly, they could put 3 points in Nature's Guidance, which would give them 3% hit with spells and melee attacks. Like I said in episode 1, gear with spell hit was very rare in vanilla, so any talents that would give you extra hit were very much appreciated. One last thing I want to mention is that some shamans would go for Nature's Swiftness over Elemental Mastery, as that would give you an instant offensive spell or even an instant heal for an emergency situation. So how did elemental shamans perform in the later stage of the game? Well, I've played a shaman on both Warsong and Retro WoW, but I only really did battlegrounds with those two characters. Which means I need someone who's a real veteran to the shaman class. Someone who raided as one for several years on vanilla servers. Someone who's completely decked out and refuses to roll with any other class because he thinks shamans are the only class that really matters. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the one and only Orcbit.
Hey guys, Orcbit here. Hamsterwheel has asked me to answer a few questions in regards to his Underdogs of Raiding series. And today we're going to be looking at the Elemental Shaman of Vanilla WoW. So, question number 1. What's your experience with the Shaman class? I've played Shaman since Vanilla WoW and pretty much up to Cataclysm. And then briefly touched it a bit after that, but mostly Vanilla, TBC and Wrath of the Lich King. The Shaman was the first class I ever played, and is to this day my favorite class. I've played all the specs, both in PvE and PvP, so it's pretty safe to say that I do enjoy the class a lot. Question number 2. In patch 1.12, are Elemental Shamans viable in raids, and why or why not? So this question is a bit tricky, because it really depends on what people mean by viable. If you compare pure DPS, of course a Shaman is not going to pull the same DPS as a Warlock or a Mage or a Rogue or Fury Warrior in equal gear. But if you look at it as what utility or does the raid benefit from this class or this person being in the raid, then yes, Elemental is very beneficial for a raid. Not only do you provide the same stuff as a Restore Shaman or an Enhancement Shaman, but you don't take up a healer spot. You might not do the same DPS as another class, but you can off-heal or purge or interrupt. Yes, a Restore Shaman can do the same, but he will have to stop healing, and that might cause a tank or people to die. You can do this by just stopping your DPS. So if you look at it pure utility-wise, Shamans do bring a lot to the table, and with the right gear and a lot of consumables, Elemental Shamans actually do pull their weight in raids. However, it's better to have them later on in the game. Let's say the patch 1.12, BVL, AQ, Nax gear, especially once you get the penetration gear. One of the major problems of Elemental Shamans is that nature damage is not included in the curses like Curse of Elements for Warlocks and stuff like that. So you don't have a decreased amount of resistance on the target, which gives you a lot of partial resists or complete resists, which takes a lot of your damage away. Combine that with really low mana efficiency, that's pretty much why the Elemental Shaman is regarded as not viable. However, once you get some penetration gear, use some consumables, and you really put your weight into it and show your guild that you really are going to do this all the way, you are going to be pulling your weight. Question number 3. If one would go Elemental for some dungeons or CG, what's the rotation like? It's no secret that in vanilla most rotations are somewhat simple, and the same goes for the Shaman. However, due to your mana inefficiency, you kind of have to think when engaging in a boss fight. The way I play when I raid as Elemental is I have 3 different ranks of Lightning Bolt, 10, 8 and 6. They all cost different amount of mana, of course, 6 being the least amount, 10 being the maximum amount. So what you do is you try to time the length of the boss fight to your mana pool, which means if your mana pool allows you to fire, let's say, 2 minutes straight of Lightning Bolt rank 10, but the boss fight is 3 minutes, then you kind of have to incorporate some rank 8 or 6 of Lightning Bolt in order to be able to DPS throughout the whole fight. Of course, this is combined with mana pots and runes and all that jazz, but I hope you get the point. This kind of makes the rotation a bit more interesting in my opinion, because you kind of have to work around this lack of optimization with the whole spec, and this is pretty much what makes vanilla. You have to think, you have to make things work yourself. The game is not going to do it for you. Alright, question number 4. How well would an Elemental Shaman do in terms of DPS compared to other classes? See, this is where it gets tricky, because Shamans are burst DPS, which is also the reason why they run out of mana. You can do more DPS than other classes, but in the long run, you're going to do less DPS. And that's why they are regarded as non-viable. But you can make them work, as I said, with the consumables, the right rotations, and the right gear. It's just really hard getting there, and it's kind of hard to find a guild who will help you get there. But don't give up. It's a really fun spec to play, both in PvE and PvP. I enjoyed it a lot. That was it for me. Orcbit out.
And thank you, Orcbit, for sharing your experience. If any of you are interested in Orcbit's content, you can check out the link in the description below. He's also going to bring out a very comprehensive guide for the Elemental Shaman in Vanilla WoW, so be sure to stay tuned for that as well. Anyway, let's move on to the second era of WoW, the Burning Crusade. Just like the Balanced Druid, the Elemental Shaman got a major boost in terms of their DPS, longevity and even their utility. This right here is the Shaman talent tree in the Burning Crusade, and Shamans got some seriously cool talents from this era. First of all, Elemental Shamans got a lot more in terms of longevity, with Unrelenting Storm now giving them extra mana regeneration, and the revamp of clear casting. You see, before the Burning Crusade, the talent clear casting would give you a 10% chance on every spell for the next spell to be completely free of charge in terms of mana. In the Burning Crusade, clear casting would proc every time you get a critical strike with spells, and it would reduce the mana cost of your next 2 offensive spells by 40%. This was one of the reasons Elemental Shamans were obsessed with crit in the Burning Crusade, as the ideal situation for an Elemental Shaman was one where you had clear casting up all the time during a boss fight. And what do you know, Shamans got a ton of extra crit and hit chance just from their talents. Any other class was lucky if they got around 3 to 5% extra hit and or extra crit, but Shamans got a total of 12% extra hit and a whopping 14% extra crit chance. No, really, they got 6% crit from Call of Thunder, 6% hit from Elemental Precision, 3% hit and 3% crit from Totem of Wrath, 3% hit from Nature's Guidance, and another 5% crit from Tidal Mastery. This meant that even a low-geared Shaman was able to pull off some very impressive numbers in lower level dungeons, and with that extra mana regeneration, Elemental Shamans were finally being able to last long enough for an average boss fight. One last totem I want to talk about is one that was introduced in the Burning Crusade, the Wrath of Air totem. Now back in vanilla, every single melee class and the hunters got extra DPS through either Strength of Earth or Grace of Air. For a caster DPS? Well, they pretty much got nothing other than a little bit more survivability with Mana Spring totem. Luckily though, we now have the Wrath of Air totem, a totem that gives everyone in the party an extra 101 spell damage. Not to mention, when you hit level 70 as a Shaman, you got what is probably the biggest DPS increase to any raid group in the Burning Crusade. Bloodlust. Bloodlust would increase the attack speed of everyone in your group by another 30% for 40 whole seconds. That was huge, and in any boss fight where it was a total DPS race, Bloodlust could often make or break a boss attempt. Because of all these extra buffs, Elemental Shamans were in high demand for any raid group. If you had a group full of casters and you didn't get an Elemental Shaman to buff them, you're doing something wrong. I mean, think about it. If you had a group made out of a few warlocks, mages and or balanced druids, an Elemental Shaman would give them 3% extra hit, 3% extra crit, 101 extra spell damage and a Bloodlust every 10 minutes. That is a total no-brainer for anyone trying to form a solid raid group. So things were looking pretty good for the Elemental Shaman, right? Well, yeah, but there were still a few problems. First of all, Shamans had no CC abilities, which definitely was their shortcoming in some dungeons. One that comes to mind is Shattered Halls, where you would usually bring at least one guy who can CC, cause the mobs in there hit like trucks. Second of all, their rotation was unfortunately still very boring. If the fight was over quick enough, Shamans were able to sneak Chain Lightning in the rotation and maybe Flame Shock, but in long fights such as Prince Malchezaar and Karazhan, most Elemental Shamans were unfortunately chained to that rotation they had ever since vanilla, which was putting down totems, spamming Lightning Bolt, refreshing totems, spamming Lightning Bolt, rinse and repeat. Alright, so the rotation was admittedly a little boring, but what about their damage output? Were they finally able to give the other DPS a run for their money? Well, as I explained, they were quite powerful in the early stages of the game because they got so much from their talents, and the same applied to the entry-level raids like Karazhan and Gruul's Lair. I had a level 70 Elemental Shaman on the Phoenix Archangel server, and that character could do 1000 DPS without a sweat, and I would often find myself being in the top 3 of the damage meters when doing Karazhan. Later in the game, they did kinda dip down in terms of position on the DPS list, simply because certain specs in the Burning Crusade stacked really well with gear, so naturally those specs eventually left the Elemental spec behind. One of these specs is the Shadow Destro spec for the Warlocks, where they put all their talents to buffing Shadow Bolt. The more gear they had, the better it stacked, and eventually those Shadow Destro locks were throwing out 8k, sometimes even 9 or 10k Shadow Bolts in raids such as Mount Hyjal or Sunwell Plateau. And as solid as the Elemental Shaman was in terms of DPS, it just couldn't keep up with those kinds of specs. One last thing I have to mention is that Shamans were never very strong when it comes to AoE. Now, if it comes down to small packs of mobs, they can reign supreme if they can get some lucky Chain Lightning crits. But when it comes to bigger packs, they just don't really have anything that can keep up with a Warlock or a Mage. Sure, they have Magma Totem, but that doesn't do a whole lot of DPS, and Chain Lightning only hits 3 targets. By far not enough to do enough damage for the Elemental Shaman to stay high in the DPS list during big packs of mobs. Still though, we have to realize that an Elemental Shaman is not just about DPS. I mean, I just spent a minute or two explaining just how much they can buff the group, and those Warlocks can partially thank the Elemental Shaman in the group for being able to do such insane crits. The Burning Crusade was a great era for the Elemental Shamans. They were welcomed with open arms to raids, They did great DPS in the beginning of the game and still managed to pull their own weight in the later raids. The only thing that was really keeping this class down was that tedious rotation and the lack of AoE damage during big packs of mobs. But fear not, because Sunwell has been out for some time and Blizzard just announced a new expansion. And so we arrive at the second expansion of World of Warcraft, Wrath of the Lich King. And oh boy, did Blizzard ever have some cool things in mind for the Elemental Shaman this expansion. Let's start off with the talent tree. This is a basic spec for any Elemental Shaman that wanted to raid in Wrath of the Lich King. As you can see, it's the first time in years we're now putting talents in the enhancement tree rather than the retro tree. Simply because Thundering Strikes now also gives us extra crit with spells and extra spell damage for Flame Tongue weapon. Also, Flame Tongue weapon prior to Wrath of the Lich King was just something that would give you extra fire damage on your weapon, but now it will also give you a nice spell damage bonus if you used it. Moving on, Shamans got extra damage on their main offensive spells with Shamanism. Elemental Mastery was reworked to give you an instant cast and extra haste for 15 seconds, and as a little extra, you got Thunderstorm. Thunderstorm would regenerate mana, do damage to everyone around you within 10 yards, and knock all those enemies back, which in PvP made for some great trolling moves in Eye of the Storm for instance, where enemy players would just get knocked off the map. But I digress, because Shamans in Wrath of the Lich King got what is arguably my favorite spell of all time, Lava Burst. As I explained earlier, the rotation of Shamans in the Burning Crusade was a little boring, so with an extra offensive spell in the mix, things got a little bit more interesting. Especially because as long as you would have Flame Shock on the target, this spell would be a guaranteed crit every single time. This meant that finally, the rotation for Elemental Shamans was a bit more interesting, which was apply Flame Shock, use Lava Burst whenever it's off cooldown, use Lightning Bolt in between, and maybe Chain Lightning if you can spare the mana. Another cool thing was that you could now put down 4 totems at the same time, which means that it would only take you 1 global cooldown to put down whatever totems you wanted, instead of having to drop them down individually, which meant you couldn't do any damage for 6 seconds straight in the Burning Crusade days. All these changes made the Shaman class, in my humble opinion, a lot more interesting in raids. I'll be honest here and say that I loved raiding with my Elemental Shaman on Phoenix Archangel, but you can imagine me getting a little bored of spamming Lightning Bolt for a month or two in raids and maybe throwing out the occasional Chain Lightning. Hence why I was very happy to see that the rotation of Elemental Shamans became much more engaging and interesting in Wrath of the Lich King. With Lava Burst being an Elemental Shaman's heavy hitter, they were once again providing solid DPS and giving the rest a run for their money. In the later stage of the game though, they kinda got overrun by a Fury Warrior with Shadowmourne for instance, as a Fury Warrior with that kind of gear will be able to pull crazy DPS and leave an Elemental Shaman in the dust. Still though, on their own they did just fine in terms of DPS, and as I said before in this video, DPS is not the only thing Elemental Shamans are about. They shouldn't be seen as just a damage dealer, they're a great support class, arguably one of the best in the game. Oh, and one last thing I want to add is that their AoE damage was also buffed drastically, as Magma Totem did way more damage, and they had Fire Nova and Thunderstorm as instant AoE spells for some serious damage. Finally, Elemental Shamans could be useful during big packs of mobs and watch the fancy numbers pop up on their screen like any other class who could AoE. They've definitely had a rough start in the early days of vanilla, with them forced to go Restoration due to the crucial talents in the Restoration tree, the lack of solid DPS in raids, and the negative stigma attached to the spec. But they've come a long way ever since 2004. No longer were they seen as a laughing matter, as something that should be strictly for PvP and nothing else. Oh no, they've definitely grown from an underdog to being a serious contender, and as someone who absolutely loves the Elemental Shaman, I couldn't be happier. And that concludes episode 2 of the Underdogs of Raiding. I'll be back soon with another episode, but until then, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel and have a good one.